All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. And good afternoon and good morning to folks from across the country. My name is Chris Bast. I'm the Director of EV Infrastructure Investments here at the Electrification Coalition. Thanks again for joining us today for what is the third webinar in our Charging Infrastructure Week webinar series. We've had a great week of events here at the Coalition and other engaging content. And just a shout out to our Vice President of Policy, Catherine Stankin, who testified yesterday in Washington, D.C. about the importance of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the importance of continued action on EV policy and implementation activities from the federal government. So check that out. We've got sent out an email and have some content on our social channels for more from Catherine. And before we get started today on our topic today, a few logistical details on the next slide. Maybe. There it is. So we will be recording the webinar and we'll share it out later. I know there's been lots of questions about that, so watch your email for the link to that. We're also going to be live tweeting the conversation today throughout the event and afterwards, so you can join us in that. You can see our Twitter handle there, and we'll also be in the chat. And to ask a question, importantly, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. Instead of putting your question in the chat, I expect we'll have a good, robust conversation with lots of questions. We want to make sure that we can see those and elevate questions to the panel. So make sure you use the Q&A function for that instead of the chat. And next slide. Just a quick reminder for folks about who we are. The Electrification Coalition is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that advances the policies and actions to accelerate widespread adoption of electric vehicles in order to overcome the economic, public health, and national security challenges caused by our dependence on oil. And I joined the Electrification Coalition recently in January after working to accelerate transportation electrification and clean energy with both the Commonwealth of Virginia and the city of Seattle. And joined because of this opportunity to engage states and cities in incredible initiatives and investment from the federal government. States and cities have been in the driver's seat for electric vehicles for some time now, but now with great partners in Washington, we have an opportunity to accelerate the transition. So through legislation, international leadership, business innovation, and support for state and local governments, the federal government is engaged in accelerating transportation electrification in a truly unprecedented way. And really, this moment is a catalytic flashpoint opportunity. We are at a critical juncture to secure an electric transportation future. And of course, the reason that we're all here today is because the federal government has made $7.5 billion available in funding to build a truly nationwide network of EV charging stations. And it's critical that these federal resources be allocated well and with good success. It's a big job ahead of us. It's not going to be easy. It's important that we understand that there are challenges ahead of us. But just like the federal government is taking a whole of government approach to issues of clean energy, clean transportation, and climate change, as Catherine said yesterday in her testimony, we need a whole of stakeholder approach to drive successful implementation of these initiatives. So today's conversation is going to focus on one piece of that, the considerations at the intersection of the electric grid and the transportation system. These are two big, unwieldy systems that we're now audaciously merging together. With $7.5 billion on the table for a nationwide network of EV charging stations, the scope and scale of the challenge is increasing exponentially. And thankfully, there are super smart people working on these issues who are prepared to help support states and communities by identifying the challenges, breaking down barriers, and innovating unique solutions. Next slide. We're super happy that we have some of those smart people with us today to dig into some of these questions. And so this is going to be a conversation instead of the usual panel presentation. And I'm really excited to have all of these folks here with us today to engage in that conversation. I think what we're going to do next is I will introduce each of them all at once here and then give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and then really dig into questions. So as a reminder, if you do have any questions that come up, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the window, and we'll just get going. So first up, Marcy Bauer. Marcy is Senior Vice President of Program Delivery for EVgo. Marcy has been working in the clean transportation space for over 12 years, and her experience spans the entire sector, OEM engagement, consumer and fleet education, charging station site development, and host engagement, public policy, utility engagement, and industry analysis. Marcy is responsible for EVgo's EV charger deployment from start to finish and compliance with the various contracts associated with that deployment. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Molecular Biology from Vanderbilt University, her Master of Environmental Science from Miami University in Ohio, and served as an officer in the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Corps. Next, Ben Serurier. Ben is a manager with RMI's carbon-free electricity practice. His work focuses on accelerating the clean transition in wholesale power markets. Prior to RMI, Ben advised corporate renewable energy transactions for Level 10 Energy and managed Western market development for Cypress Creek Renewables. He holds a BA from Whitman College and a Master's of Environmental Management from Yale University and lives in San Francisco. Last, Evan Costaliola is a principal and one of Nelson Nygaard's emerging mobility practice leaders. He has 14 years of experience in multimodal transportation policy and planning and is a national thought leader in emerging transportation technology policy, regulation, and pilot delivery. With insights from his time at Lime and leading new mobility and electric mobility implementation at the Seattle Department of Transportation, Evan is adept at developing and delivering an electric mobility strategy, electric mobility hubs, and right-of-way electrification. While at Seattle DOT, Evan led the implementation side of the city's Drive Clean Seattle initiative and developed the nation's first curbside EV charging open permitting and policy framework. He also recently completed a National League of Cities capstone challenge for enterprise holdings, leading the development of an equitable electric mobility playbook for cities. So we've collected a great group of folks here, experts in the electricity system, the transportation system, the intersection of both, and one of the leading implementation program delivery teams in the country. I've worked with all of these folks in different capacities and I'm really excited for the conversation today. So let's just get into it and go to Marcy first. If you guys want to take a few minutes here to reintroduce yourself, build on any of that introduction and speak a little bit at how you see yourself fitting in at the intersection here of the electricity grid and the transportation network. So Marcy, let's start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. So EVgo is the largest public fast charger company in the US. We have over 800 charging locations in about 35 states and growing. I think growth is probably going to be a feature thread throughout this webinar. Our mission is really anchored on the dual mantras of EVs for all. We want to make sure that everyone is able to get into an EV. We also want to make sure that it's clean electric for them, really trying to neutralize any lingering concern or I guess excuses if we're being less kind, any lingering concern there might be about, but where does the electricity come from? And along those lines, we were also the first to be 100% renewable energy powered since 2019. We work with the entire charging ecosystem along the way. So as you know, Chris asked me to describe how we slot into the stakeholders that he went through earlier. It's pretty much all of them from start to finish. Automakers, federal and state funding partners, utilities, permitting authorities, the property owners that host our chargers, advocacy groups, charger manufacturers, and of course, the EV driving customers as well, whether they're members of the general public, driving their personal vehicle or fleet customers. So that's the ecosystem that we're working with and trying to pull in. I would say if I had to give like a little elevator pitch on what we do, it's that we aim to make EV fast charge deployments look and then actually be easy. But in reality, there are still a lot of challenges along the way. So last year, we set up a stakeholder group and initiative called Connect the Watts, aimed at bringing all of those stakeholders I just mentioned and that Chris kind of opened with to really collaboratively identify and break down barriers, develop and deploy best practices across the entire lifespan of the charger deployment, from ideation and first approach to a site host, all the way through to turning it on and engaging with our customers. And really just generally make sure that we're all aligned around the market dynamics, which, as I said at the start, is all about growth. Everything's pointing to major growth and demand for EV fast charging, and that's going to ripple throughout the ecosystem and impact every point along the way. So we're just really trying to bring everybody together and get everyone aligned around that and ready for it.
Thank you so much, Marcy. That's a really great segue, I think, especially the clean energy piece of this, to go over to Ben and hear more about his work and how it intersects here with transportation electrification.
Thanks, Chris. So hi, everyone. It's great to be on this panel. It's a timely discussion. So I'm Ben Serurier. RMI is a organization that I think many people on this call may have intersected with or worked with in some capacity. We do have a number of programs on building electrification and transportation electrification. I work on the carbon-free electricity program. And so my approach to this whole question is really coming from the electric system. And as Chris sort of teed up in his intro, we have complex electric planning systems and whole markets that are devoted to the electric planning system. And we have entire systems focused on the transportation planning system. And as we look to electrify transportation, we see sort of a nexus and an increasing merging of these two already complex systems. And I fear that these are not additive. They're in fact multiplicative of that complexity. And so I'm excited to talk more with the folks on the transportation side to look at how the complexities of these systems actually do work together and can be complementary. Most of my work has been in the wholesale power markets, and RMI is thinking about ways that we can expand while we decarbonize the power grid, to use that really as the backbone for the decarbonization efforts of the transportation sector, the industrial sector, and the building sector. And we have a great opportunity to basically segue into that with the infrastructure bill that was passed last year and some of the programs that'll be funded out of that. So looking forward to discuss more about what are the potential obstacles, but then perhaps more importantly, where are the opportunities for to use everyone's favorite word, synergies between the transportation sector and the electric power grid.
Awesome, Ben. Thank you. Evan, what's your contribution here to the synergy of it all?
Well, first off, thank you, Chris, for inviting me onto this panel. This is very exciting to be talking about this topic. Just a little bit about me. I'm a principal at Nelson Nygaard. I've been at the firm for about 10 years. And the firm actually is a sustainable mobility consultancy. We do a lot of work in the multimodal transportation planning, policy, and design space. Specifically related to electric mobility, we focus our time on projects mostly related to equitable electric mobility strategies, as well as strategies that bring electric mobility to communities in ways that unlock other community goals that go well beyond transportation. I do have background in public sector as well. I worked with Chris while I was at the Seattle Department of Transportation. I led their new mobility program. At the time, it was I believe it was the first new mobility program in the country. Now there's dozens around the country, but most of my role was really related to advancing shared mobility, but also serving as the implementation lead for the Drive Clean Seattle initiative. I did spend time at Lime as well, so I am one of those weird unicorns that has both public sector mobility planning expertise, but also kind of transportation technology expertise on the private sector side. So most of my clients are actually cities and transit agencies to help them understand how to better play in the electric mobility space. I also do work with private providers or technology providers to help them better actually collaborate with cities and transit agencies. So kind of connecting the dots between how the different players work. I also tend to connect the dots between everything related to transportation electrification, meeting community priorities, and then all the way down into the nitty-gritty details of right-of-way management and curbside management. And so, there's a lot of interest to expand electric vehicle charging infrastructure, but as I've experienced and Chris has experienced, and I'm sure everyone else on this panel has experienced, the devil's in the details, and there's a lot of challenges to getting infrastructure in the ground.
Absolutely. And I think that, Marcy, one of those details that site hosts and maybe project managers or companies that are installing stations, especially fast chargers, seem to get caught unaware of is demand charges. I know that's a exciting topic for you that you've worked through in particular. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit for our audience about what demand charges are, the impact they have on deployment, and the different considerations that folks could look at for managing or avoiding demand charge issues that city and state planners ought to know.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, demand charges are the electricity bill demolishing tariff feature that happens when you have a really steep peak in use at a particular location on a particular node. And what that does is it kicks the entire usage for that month into a higher rate per kilowatt hour. So you could have, only 2 or 3 or 4 uses the entire month, but if they all happen on the same day, at the same time, that can kick the entire month's bill into orders of magnitude higher cost. So yes, we do have very deeply embedded interest in addressing that so that it's right-sized and right applied for the EV charging model, especially in the earlier days of EV adoption when utilization across the United States isn't really consistent or consistently high enough to offset that naturally.
Ben, you talked a little bit about, you talked a lot about the idea that we ought to be using the our carbon-free electricity and sort of expanding renewable energy to deliver clean power for the electrification of our society, right? I mean, that's sort of like decarbonization strategy 101. Marcy talked a little bit in the beginning. One of the key things that she works on is helping folks understand that no matter where you charge across the country, using electricity for your mobility is more efficient, it's cleaner, less carbon intense than using oil. But even still, a lot of the appeal for folks is like they don't want just any electricity. They want 100% clean electrons. Some folks like EVgo, has been able to, they use RECs and whatnot to help deliver that. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about like any technology or services or sort of how the electricity system is prepared to deliver clean electrons to mobility solutions.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I feel this has been true for a while, but I don't know how many times we need to keep repeating it. And it sounds like we should still do so, that there are effectively no places in the US where driving an EV is dirtier than driving an internal combustion petroleum powered car. And you see the dumb cartoons about people plugging their EV into a coal plant, and that's not true anywhere in this country. However, you're right. There are times that the grid is dirty and the times that the grid is less dirty. A lot of the incentives that people see when they do charge their EV happen to come through retail rates. As Marcy was talking about with demand charges, those are sort of the peaky loads. So sort of as you plug in your EV and your demand spikes, it's that highest possible demand is what drives that demand charge. If you are able to smooth out that demand over time or lower that peak, it will lower that demand charge, and also you won't have quite as much variation of draw on the grid, and that can be helpful for managing the grid. If retail rates that the utilities and the electric system are passing through to their customers, the end user, that will drive behavior. So for example, I live in California, we have an enormous amount of solar power. And so in the middle of the day, historically, the middle of the day has been sort of a peak hours of the day. And usually that's been driving higher electricity use and therefore dirtier sources of generation. However, now that we have all this solar coming on the grid, and that's coming to more and more states every year, it's the fastest source of new electricity on the grid. You're going to have, in fact, an abundance of clean electrons in the middle of the day. And so in California, we have time of use rates across the state, which incentivize usage of resources during the middle of the day, because that is the lowest cost and it happens to also be the cleanest. And so those end use rates and being able to program, for example, your EV and trying to change that behavior automatically can be a great way to drive demand when we want more electricity to be used because it is cheaper and cleaner.
Is that the infamous duck curve in California?
Yes, smoothing the duck curve, driving demand from 5 p.m. to say noon.
Evan, as you talked about, you've been involved in a number of EV and EV charging deployment programs in cities and in dense communities. I know we worked on some getting charging stations deployed curbside in Seattle, which was at the time, the fastest growing city in the country with, lots of new load on the grid. And, trying to put a charging station with demand issues, potentially, in the mix of all of that has some unique challenges. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, those types of, unique challenges that were maybe unexpected, or some like quirks of new charging stations that were unexpected when thinking about like bringing electricity into the transportation system.
Yeah, so in order to understand some of the more site-specific challenges, it's important to understand the context within which, especially the Department of Transportation's are working and where they are in terms of level of understanding. Generally speaking, I'm a transportation planner by training. That's my background, and a lot of the times, the folks that are on this panel and are listening to this panel, they are working with transportation planners when they're trying to get EV infrastructure in the ground. And transportation planners generally don't speak the language of the grid, and they don't understand kilowatt hours. And when I started in the space, basically everything that I knew was what Chris Patz told me. And so, there's a little bit of a learning curve. I think one of the other big challenges is that transportation electrification generally does not show up in your foundational transportation policy and plans. So, the North Star kind of guidance documents that transportation planners use as their Bible when they're making decisions and helping to their decision makers understand what the priorities are in the public right of way or in public facilities. Transportation electrification, it just is not there, right? So if there is no policy related to transportation electrification or EV charging installation, you better believe that there's not going to be a process to actually deliver it, or at least the process is murky. And that was the case in the city of Seattle, which at the time was still fairly advanced compared to its city peers. Some of the things that we were dealing with related to site identification, and then understanding what unlocks a site for installation. It's really complex for a variety of different reasons. There are legacy standards that electric vehicle charging infrastructure installation needs to be adhered to. There are siting principles that the kind of EV infrastructure developers don't care about as much as transportation planners or decision makers. And then there are EV charging infrastructure developer preferences for siting, and they just don't align, or typically they don't align. We think about things from like a right-of-way management or a curb management standpoint. We think about things like, is there enough sidewalk width to put a large DC fast charger in the ground? Is there enough parking lane width? A lot of the developers are looking for spaces where you can do head-in parking. That's not really a thing in the public right of way. Is there three-phase power at the location that's ideal for installation? Some places they don't have that, so that means a massive investment in grid enhancement, and then trenching, obviously. Accessibility guidelines, that was a huge issue related to the work that Chris and I did on curbside charging and kind of public property installation. So identifying the space that can actually support the accessibility requirements of a site. So it's a really complex process, both at the site level, but also when you take things out to a more broader level. It's complex for the folks that EV charging developers are working with the transportation planners or you know, the city administrators that are trying to push things through.
Marcy, let's talk about permitting then for a second, right? Like, so it sounds like that is you know, your work is completely focused on fast charging, right? I mean, that's and so I wonder then if like what actually needs to happen to turn a site on, and these some of these challenges and barriers, especially in cities that Evan talked about. How do you deal with them? Are they barriers? Do you even, you know, cross places off your list for certain reasons? And what are those reasons? And how do you sort of deal with the permitting environment? I know in some folks in solar, that's been a big issue over the past decade, you know, thinking about driving the soft costs down associated with solar permitting and things like that. And so it's like flipping over now, we're scaling up EV infrastructure, and are we going to be looking at those same type of issues?
Yeah, so first of all, I saw the comment that my audio was a little muffled, so I'm holding my phone closer, and I hope that helps. It does impede my ability to type answers to questions as well, but I hope you'll forgive me for that. I also wanted to highlight one of the answers that I did provide in the sidebar, because it kind of does feed in a little bit to what Evan was just talking about, in that the question was something along the lines of standardization of the ports, of the plugs, but really for everything that Evan just described, it would be super helpful for us if the automakers would standardize the port location, because it could enable and open up additional options for the things that he's describing that EV charging networks are not allergic to at all. We just, you know, being an electric for all focused entity, we have to be able to provide charging to every vehicle that's going to have a port in 5, you know, the port possibilities are 5 different placements on the vehicle at least these days. So that's just on the vehicle side, not necessarily on the permitting, but it's another sort of hidden constraint that a lot of, you know, consumers, even fairly well-informed consumers, don't necessarily consider when we're trying to find a location, design the location, check to see, make sure the design is feasible, work through all of the permitting processes and utility design processes that we have to work through to bring a project even just to the point where it can mobilize, and then get it all built and turned on from there. So dialing into the permitting piece specifically, since that's what you asked about, it is a giant pain in the butt, actually, now that you mention it. And we are trying to learn a lot of lessons, every lesson that we can from the solar industry. So we're not just trying to reinvent, and we're working with a lot of the same groups to try and directly apply those lessons and those inroads that they've made and the partnerships that they've made and the progress that they've made on the ground to apply that to the EV charging deployment sector. So that's well underway, again, through the Connect the Watts initiative, where I think we have there's a working group now within SEAC, and I apologize, I don't remember the full, precise, accurate spelling out of that acronym, but it was originally focused on solar permitting, and they've now got, you know, thanks to our efforts with them, have a working group to try and streamline or encourage the streamlining of permitting for EV charger deployment, which is fantastic. But generally speaking, it's a lot of different considerations that, again, the ordinary EV driving public wouldn't necessarily realize. We want to try to stay somewhat close to the point of connection with utility, because you know, the farther away you get, orders of magnitude higher costs come with it. But then now you're talking about possibly putting equipment in right of way, and they don't super love that. And the AHJs, the permitting authorities, don't super love that. So we have to balance that. We have to consider the site host constraints and needs. We have to consider those multitudinous port locations so that we can make sure, however we're orienting things, everyone can reach them. We have to consider ADA. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into citing, drawing up a design for, and getting approval for a charger to go in.
Yeah, that I would add onto what Marcy had mentioned. And at first, I'm going to shout out to Shannon Walker, who I worked with at Seattle Department of Transportation. She's now at Rivian, and she did manage the permitting process, our kind of makeshift permitting process that we pulled together, and did a pretty fantastic job trying to make that work. But you know, the original question that Chris had was, what are some of the problems? And it was like, it's mostly problems. There's just a lot of problems to be solved, both in terms of the structure of the permit, which wasn't one permit, it was 3 permits in one. It was kind of like a Frankenstein's monster. So in terms of the permit, but also when you get to the site level, when there's an application put in to put in chargers on public property or in the public right of way, there are just so many different barriers that you have to overcome. And you know, you start with, we think that it makes sense to go in this location, and then you identify the 17 different things that are wrong with that location, and then you have to kind of move it around to find the right place. We had 68 applications during the 2.5 years of that pilot program, and 2 chargers went in. Two chargers, and that is
Ouch.
That big ouch for you, Marcy, and for us too. Like a lot of time was spent trying to make it work, and so you know, I think part of the challenge is the process itself. There isn't a really good way at this point, or someone hasn't devised it to actually create a seamless application process. No one's devised a process to get EV charging at the front of the queue with the utility. And, you know, one of the big challenges for us at a DOT is, you know, the public right of way has many different demands, and, you know, EVgo is going to want to put a charger in the hotspot, the highest demand location that it has a lot of competition. And so, you know, we as transportation planners need to navigate a lot of those trade-offs, whether we want to prioritize electric vehicle charging in the public right of way, or if we want to prioritize putting it in a protected bike lane, or putting in a transit lane, or putting in more passenger loading because there's more TNCs operating in streets.
Pickup, yeah, grocery and store pickup type stuff also competes now. Exactly.
So I feel like most of my work these days, even though it might be, you know, I might be on a project that's related to electric mobility, but it's really just managing all the demands, period.
I just want to highlight, so you mentioned a couple of things, and we are actually working and achieving some success in several of the areas, Evan, that you just mentioned, including in the permitting lane and in the utility lane, because you're absolutely right. Shoving EV charger projects just in the general queue with construction, like from the utility perspective, a project's load profile will, you know, an EV chargers project load profile will look exactly the same as a fairly large shopping mall, right? So for them, it's on their side, it's no different. But on our side, a shopping mall can take over a year to build, and we're like 6 weeks. We can build in anywhere from 1 week to maybe 8 weeks at the upper limit for our actual construction needs. That's a huge disparity in how they're getting treated versus how fast they could possibly go live. And of course, the utilities should be aligned in wanting those to go live too, because the load profile is so great, right? So we are working very closely with utilities on various different parallel processes to try and break some of that down. Whether it's a utility that does have a fast track lane for EV chargers, or they've, you know, some utilities have made really strong headway in other obstacles that we encounter along the way in the, you know, upstream in the design phase, where they're trying to assess feasibility and draw up like easement documents, which is probably gibberish for some people, but it's a barrier that it's one of the 17 barriers that Evan described earlier. And we're working really closely with utilities to break all of those down, applying best practices wherever we can. And Mary Brazel, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asked about specific lessons learned to streamline permitting. We actually published a best practices document, separate documents for permitting, for utilities, for public funding, all based on these conversations that we've had with those specific stakeholders, and on the successes that we've actually experienced and generated with some of those stakeholders. Still on a little bit of a small scale. We'd love for it to be adopted more broadly, but it feels very exciting, like on the cusp of something bigger. But I think for permitting, you know, when the state tells the locals to do something, that's always super helpful. It's not super popular, but it's helpful. So that you'll find that in the best practice document.
And that's I'm glad you brought some of that up, Marcy. Just a plug for this new work that we're taking on here at the Electrification Coalition, right? Is that we got $7.5 billion on the table for charging infrastructure. It can be deployed well, or it can be deployed poorly. And, you know, the charge, I think, for all of us is maximizing this the best way possible. And one of the ways that we can do that is you know, $7.5 billion talks. And, you know, to use like, you know, MPA language, it throws open a policy window. You know, that Overton window is wide open for policy change on things like permitting, or you know, other types of you know, ways that we can smooth this process out. And so I think thinking through these types of challenges and being like, oh, that a charging station takes 3 weeks to construct, a building takes 18 months, they probably shouldn't be in the same queue, right, for electrical service. So that could be an easy solution. I do want to zoom out though for a second and bring Ben back in here. There's been a few questions in the chat, and I know just in general, folks are concerned when we think about beneficial electrification, and we think about, hey, you know, the federal government is looking to do at least 500,000 charging stations with this money. We're electrifying buildings, we're electrifying industry, we're electrifying like a lot of, you know, this heavy load that Marcy talked about all at once. Do we have enough electricity? like how does that work? Some folks have talked about transmission. I know you love transmission. Like, how are we going to?
Yeah, I mean, so everyone, yeah, it's complex, right? It depends. The answer is yes, we have enough electricity. The electric system is an incredibly complex network, right? It's really cool because we're balancing load and generation all across the country, almost instantaneously, right? It's really an incredible achievement of engineering. When we start adding, there's nothing particularly unique about electrifying a building or electrifying transportation. We have been adding new load to the grid, new demand to the grid ever since we started generating electricity, right? So adding new load is something that we plan for. It's something that's expected. And increasingly, as we decarbonize the grid from its generation sources, something that we should be encouraging. What is key to understand is the distributional impacts of where and how those new loads affect what our current portfolio of generating resources look like, and the tools that utilities have to manage load on the user side and on the generation supply side. At the most localized level, an EV, you know, if everyone on your block gets an EV, that will have very acute impacts on the distribution system on your block and the existing infrastructure that's being set up to serve your house and now your car. On a macro level, these changes, although EVs are growing really quickly, they're happening in particular areas more so than others, and they're happening in the grand scheme of the grid fairly incrementally, in part because people charge at night or because they're charging in places that already have robust distribution infrastructure. So not every megawatt hour that we're adding, or kilowatt hour to use a more retail relevant metric, that's added to the demand side of the ledger is going to have massive impacts across the grid, and we're planning for the eventual increase in load. What I do think is important, though, to note is that utilities in the electric system are, you know, small c conservative systems, heavily engineered. We need things to work, and so people are fairly cautious about making dramatic prognostications about future demand growth, for example. And we've seen this with the growth of renewables. A lot of estimates have undershot the growth of solar and wind and battery storage because folks are unwilling or, you know, temperamentally challenged in seeing what the economics are showing them. EVs and the growth of EVs are starting to get into that exponential phase. And I think it's critical that folks on the transportation side who see these changes coming engage early with their counterparts at local utilities, utility commissions, and some of those, you know, windowless conference rooms where a lot of the decisions around load growth assumptions are made. Got to engage early with those groups because we don't want to get into a situation where EV growth is constrained by grid forecasts because folks didn't have the communication between the transportation and the electric side to better understand where this growth was coming and what it could look like. We need to make sure that commissions are giving utilities the tools that they need to see into electric charging profiles, and hopefully, you know, create some opportunities that we can have distributed, you know, cars on the grid that are charging at the right time, that help integrate renewables that are coming on to the grid in equal measure. And that could be a really beautiful growth profile for both sides of the supply and demand part of the grid. I suspect Evan and Marcy have had some of those conversations on the distribution level with utilities that have gone to various degrees of success about how to think about the growth of EVs in their service territory.
Well, and how about that for Evan and Marcy? Like, I imagine, yeah, your conversations have mostly been at the utility level. Is it also at the commission level, or even the like grid marketer level? Like, where are you engaging in this conversation?
We're engaging at all levels. Right now, we're actually in the middle of a little mini utility roadshow with our highest volume utilities, so that we're not, you know, you can imagine we're engaged very much at what I call sort of like the field sergeant level, just on trying to escalate and expedite projects that are actively underway but are stuck in the utility queue. It's not, we're past the earliest EV adopters where they're like actually scouring public portals to look for when the permits are pulled. Like, the early adopters were all over it. They knew a project was coming before a shovel hit the ground. We're past that point, so we don't have that as much, but they're still paying attention, and they're still noticing and commenting and grumbling when they see chargers sit appearing to be ready, but still dark, waiting on utility for weeks. So we've got sort of that level of engagement. It's like a, you know, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly cadence of here's everything that's in your queue, utility, please go faster. We've got the next level up that's forecasting out, you know, a full year to 2 years of what we expect to be coming their way. And then we've got the next executive level forecasting even farther, but also asking for things like, tell us where we should go. Where are you ready now? Let's try to go there. Let's flip it on its head and see if we can be finding sites that could go fast because there's going to be no betterment required or very little new service needed or service upgrade needed. So we're pretty much trying to hit it at every point. And it's, you know, varied success geographically, varied success along those different points, but the effort's there.
Yeah, and most of my conversations are at the utility level, and I'll speak more specifically about recent conversations on what it's going to take to upgrade the grid, especially when we're electrifying and providing EV access to disadvantaged communities in particular. And, you know, there's a big question mark as to whether or not those communities have the type of infrastructure that's needed to support public charging or fast public charging. And I'm not going to go into the details of utility strategy, but you know, as part of the electric or the equitable electric mobility playbook that we finished with Enterprise Holdings, 3 regions in particular that we work with, they are at least developing a strategy and starting to quantify the cost to actually upgrade, which is step 1, right? It also shows, you know, how behind those communities are as a result of structural racism, and that's a real thing, and it needs to be acknowledged.
Absolutely. You know, last sort of question I really wanted to ask you, and then we'll dig into some of the more specific questions that have been coming in Q&A, is it kind of builds on that a little bit. You know, the guidance document that DOT put out, you know, a lot of the focus of, at least especially these early rounds of NEVI funding, is on fully building out the alternative fuel corridors that have been designated across the country. A lot of the places that currently have gaps in those alternative fuel corridors are in rural or underserved communities, for a lot of the reasons, Evan, that you talked about, with the underserved and disadvantaged communities, and in rural communities, just because, like, you know, demand hasn't been there yet. And part of this effort is to make sure that we are building out a national network. And so that means maybe putting charging stations in places that, companies like EVgo may otherwise not have right away. But if we're talking about rural places where there's not a lot of people, there might not also be a lot of power. And, we had one question come in the chat talking about, the capacity requirements for DC fast charging and the guidance. You all mentioned earlier the need for three-phase power. I'm sure a lot of transportation planners may not understand what that is. And so, are there, as we think about, rural communities where there may not be a lot of transmission or electrical capacity, are there any sort of particular issues inherent that, like, do you see that's going to be like a big problem, Marcy? And to Ben, like, how should states be thinking about making sure they can deliver power everywhere? This is almost like phase 2 of the national electrification piece, right? We got everybody power decades ago, and now we got to like step it up so that we can power more things.
I lost the initial thread of that a little bit, but it sounded like you were talking about rural. What's that?
I said, me too. Yeah, rural electrification, right? Like, this is like, we did rural electrification as a country, and then now we got to do it with transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's true. I mean, in some of those areas, it is tough to get adequate and the right kind of power to something like a EV charger project, especially if it's a larger, super fast one that needs a lot of power. There's several different ways to accomplish that. It can be supplemented with on-site battery storage, which of course adds to cost. And at this point, given low utilization rates in those areas, it still does need to be underwritten in some way to support that. But generally speaking, utilities, including rural co-ops, supporting things like make-ready programs to help make those sites ready to make it feasible for charger networks to come in and install and operate chargers that are going to kind of continue to. They'll be the most likely ones to have those difficult to pencil electricity bills. They're not going to have super steady use day in, day out throughout the day. They're going to be kind of peaky. So, make ready combined with EV friendly rates for a time will be super important for helping to deploy in those areas. Federal and state funding programs that can help support those harder to pencil scenarios that are super important, that we all agree are super important. And then, we've got various different public-private partnership options that we're constantly pursuing because, there aren't as many people in those places, but they do still buy cars and they need to drive some miles. And so, automakers have interest and in fact, fairly high volume, if not concentrated. They're dispersed, but they have high volume bodies of customers, segments of customers that they want to capture with their next generation vehicles, which include pickup trucks and, different kinds of SUVs. So automakers know that this is going to be important. I think the funders, the different funding program administrators know that this is going to be important. I see co-ops and more dispersed utilities perking up to it as well on the importance.
Chris, you talked about the need to electrify, like that rural electrification effort going back to the New Deal and whatnot. And it's not just electrifying transportation. We also need to build a bunch new transmission lines to bring the new renewable resources that we're going to want to have on the grid and be more flexible to utilize towards load centers. And so there's a big effort right now in the power sector to think about, and in the IIJA, the investment bill, the infrastructure investment bill, to identify transmission corridors of national interest. And there's some money to help spur along some of those development projects. And not all lines are going to be optimized for where you want to put charging infrastructure, but there is a lot of effort trying to think about how do we streamline permitting, how do we get these projects going. Highway corridors are obviously a very attractive option for this because of existing infrastructure and right-of-ways, et cetera. They also bring new complications. Nothing is straightforward, but and not all lines, DC, the HVDC, high voltage DC lines that a lot of people want to build for moving renewable energy from far rural areas into load centers are not going to be good engineering options to try to have a little offtake side for a charger, but AC lines, alternating current lines, really could be. And there's a lot of opportunity that we could have depending on the type of lines, where they're identified and where they're sited. And so what we're interested when we think about this nexus between vehicle electrification and transportation electrification more broadly and the power system is when we're building these new lines, how do we future-proof them, knowing the growth of EVs that are coming, knowing the growth in renewables that are coming? When you're building a substation, does it make sense to also have charging infrastructure nearby? How do we size, say, substations or lines? How do we site lines such that they can serve both purposes? Because what we don't want to do with the limited resources that we have and the limited time that we have to meet 1.5 degrees C emissions trajectory is, how do we make sure these are optimized to work for each other? And starting that process now, DOE, DOT partnership is a great step. IIJ has money that we can start thinking about this. It forces the question. It's not enough money, but hopefully this gets the ball rolling in both sides so we can start actually planning for these things and becomes the norm more than just the exception to have conversations where we think about the capabilities of the power system and the transportation system and how they support each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are very enthusiastic about the Joint Office. The Joint Office of Energy and Transportation is the federal government's effort to do exactly this, right? Merge these two things together and make sure that we are looking at those issues. So, I think Ben, to paraphrase a little bit what you said, like transportation electrification advocates should turn into transmission advocates and be engaged in those conversations. That it's all connected, literally. Evan, I want to grab a few questions from the Q&A here. One really sort of practical thing, folks want to know, what is your advice to local communities as they start thinking about, so there's a $2.5 billion competitive grant program included in the bipartisan infrastructure law. As local communities of all sizes start to think about how they're going to pursue that competitive funding, what advice from your experience do you have to how to prepare for that? In some instances, there are communities where you've got let's use Seattle as an example, you have a central city that has had a lot of experience in that, but there are sort of, highly populated, dense suburban rings that don't have as many staff resources, that don't have much experience. Are there examples of how folks have collaborated in the past on these types of projects, and what advice might any of you have on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to this specifically to electric mobility, but we helped the Los Angeles Department of Transportation win a big infra grant, and the way that we pursued this was we built a pretty, this is a long-standing set of projects that we compiled into one mega project, and it showed very clearly what both the transportation benefits were, but also the very clear community benefits, what those were. And funds that are coming out of the US DOT, there's a much stronger focus on community benefit and equity in particular. And the proof, we'll see what happens in terms of the next set of grant evaluation processes. But in the last round of infra grants, we went very deep into equity implications. A lot of those pieces of infrastructure and those investments and the programmatic elements that were part of that bid were removed and were not funded. We believe that the next round of funding packages are going to heavily focus on that. And so, focusing on equity in particular is going to be a strong sell.
That does bring up a point here, that it's not just this charging infrastructure, $7.5 billion that is in the infrastructure law. There's a number of opportunities to advance electric transportation across the infrastructure universe, right? There's school bus funding, and even just in normal transportation funding through DERA or CMAQ and all these other different funding pots. The federal government is definitely looking towards electrification as a key outcome for those. Anything you'd add, Marcy, on that in terms of regional approaches?
sorry, regional approaches to
Like
what?
if like local governments who are thinking about, like, you know, lots of local governments don't have a lot of capacity. These smaller towns that maybe ring central cities, and, like, you know, I'm thinking about from a charging station network perspective, it's important not just to have charging stations in a central city or in a rural community. You got to be able to have it all over. And so how can communities work together? Any good examples that you could draw from?
Yeah, I mean, I think just leaning forward and taking the lessons learned from other areas so that they're ready for it. Any kind of support along the lines of what I described earlier, leaning into state and federal funding programs, so, you know, advocating for, asking for, leaning into utility make-readies. The fact of it right now is that in you know, the most rural areas, for a private sector company to go deploy those, that, you know, there's going to be some supports that are needed to make that work. And so, you know, it's going to remain important for representatives of those communities to continue to work through all of those available resources and advocate for them as well. But you know, it is important. And so I think that's one of the most exciting things about some of the federal funds that are coming out, is that it is going to start to broaden and deepen the ability to deploy into areas where, you know, boards and stockholders haven't previously been super keen on having, you know, millions of dollars spent. It is millions spent on projects like that.
Awesome.
Hundreds of thousands to millions, depending on the,
well, we are rapidly coming to the end of our time. Just want to thank you all and see if any last remarks, last things anybody wants to jump in with that we didn't get to, or clarify anything. No, great. Thank you for your work in the Q&A as well. Really appreciate the amount of answers we were able to get for folks. Thank you to Marcy, Evan, and Ben, and to everybody who joined us for your participation today. We're going to throw up a slide, I think, with some additional resources from the EC. As you head out, you can take a look at some of those, grab those links to help answer some of these questions you may have about local government, about the work that we're starting on federal infrastructure, and importantly, www.driveelectric.gov, which is the website for the Joint Office. Check it out, lots of great information there. And with that, we'll let you all go. Thank you so much to everybody for your participation, and hope you have a great end of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Shangri-La's young rascal, spotlight of all the reasons.